kept the signal alive for 19 days. That is the fact I return to most often now, when I try to make sense of what happened to us, not the stellar event that came without warning, as such things do, and our grief for Sorvan Prime is its own long work, separate from this account, not the drift itself, though the drift was its own kind of dying, slow and cold and lit only by what light we still carried inside our own bodies. What I return to is the smaller fact, the more ordinary one. I sat in the records room on the second transit deck of the Vale Sorveth Undara, and every 6 hours I broadcast the signal again, and every 6 hours the silence that came back was complete. I am Davith Vel Sorvan. I was the keeper of records aboard our colony ship, which means I held the archive, the spoken histories, the light maps of Sorvan Prime, the genealogical registers, the philosophical texts, the song. I was not a commander. I was not an engineer. I was an old woman by our reckoning, with hollow bones that ached in the cold and light organs that had gone a little dim at the edges, as they do with age, like lanterns burning low. I had no business sitting at the communications console. Our comms officers had done everything correct, filed every proper request, through every proper channel, received every proper non-response, eventually been ordered to stop transmitting by Administrator Veldoreth, because the council had spoken, and further signals were, in the administrator's word, undignified. I disagreed with the administrator about dignity, so I sat down at the console after the second night, and I kept the signal going, and for 17 more days I received nothing back. I did not stop. I should explain what we were. The Sorveth are. I write that in the present tense deliberately because we still are, though the place that made us is gone, a people of deep space. We evolved on a low-gravity world with thin atmosphere and long dark seasons, which is why our bodies learned to carry their own light. The organs are distributed beneath the skin along the major nerve pathways, 2 lines running from the base of the skull down the spine, branching along the ribs and out through the forearms to the fingertips. In good health, warmth, with proper nutrition, the light is a steady, pale teal white, like winter starlight held inside glass. When we are cold or frightened, pleated, the light gutters. On the 19th day of our drift, most of the 140,000 people aboard the Vale Sorveth Undara were barely glowing. The ship had not gone entirely dark. We had kept life support functional, barely, through enormous effort from our engineers, and we had kept heat at survivable levels, though not comfortable ones. What we had lost progressively were the amenities. The deck lighting had been sacrificed first to extend power reserves, then the secondary heating loops, then all non-essential systems, one by one, until the Vale Sorveth Undara was a great dark cathedral of a vessel moving through the deep at minimum, thrust, and the only light inside her was the light of her passengers. I had walked the residential decks on the 14th day. I needed to understand what I was broadcasting for, what face I was putting to the signal. 140,000 people is a number. It is a very large number, and it is easy. In the records room, with the console in front of you, and the silence coming back at regular intervals, relate to it as a number rather than a fact. So I walked. The corridors were dim and cold. People sat along the walls in family groups, wrapped in everything they owned, their light organs casting the faintest teal glow through layers of fabric. There was almost no sound. Sorveth do not keen or wail. Our distress is internal and quiet, expressed in the dimming of the light, in a certain stillness of the hollow bones that you can hear, if you know what to listen for, as a particular kind of silence in the resonant chambers along the jaw. The children were the hardest to look at. A healthy Sorveth child blazes. They have not learned to modulate yet. The light pours out of them without discipline, and a room full of children is almost warm. On the 14th day, the children on the residential decks were dim. They sat close to their parents, and they were quiet in the way that children are quiet when they understand, without being told, that something has gone very wrong. I went back to the records room, and I transmitted the signal again. I want to be precise about the council's position, because I have lived with it for long enough that I could let it become a caricature, and I do not think that serves the truth. The Interstellar Resettlement Council voted, 12-3, against authorizing emergency asylum proceedings for the Sorveth colony ship, Vale Sorveth Undara, on the grounds that resettlement of a population of Our size would require the use of Migration Corridor Sector 14 Veth, which had been reserved under a transit treaty with the Dreva Combine for a period of not less than 40 years. Breach that corridor for a resettlement convoy would constitute a treaty violation. The Council's position was that treaty obligation was binding, that alternatives in non-restricted space were insufficient in supply chain terms to support a convoy of the required scale, and that therefore no authorized rescue operation was possible at this time. 12-3. I read that transmission 3 times. Then I set it carefully aside in the archive. In a subfolder I labeled simply the answer, and I sat for a while in the dark listening to my own bones. And then I broadcast the signal again. I do not know what I thought would happen. I am a records keeper, not a strategist. I had no particular reason to believe that broadcasting into the silence would produce any result other than silence. The Dreva Combine was not going to help us. They were the ones who held the Corridor Treaty, and their interest in our survival was precisely zero. The Veth sovereignty had contributed 2 of the 3 dissenting votes on the council, which I recorded with gratitude in the archive, but they had no available transport capacity. The Sorveth had no military allies, no trade partners with surplus rescue capacity, no ancient debts being called in from species who owed us something. We were, in the language of political reality, not worth the cost, so I kept transmitting. Not because I expected an answer, because the alternative was to sit in the dark with 140,000 dimming lights and do nothing, and I am constitutionally unsuited to doing nothing. On the 17th day, Administrator Veldoreth came to the records room in person and asked me to stop. He was not unkind about it. He sat across from me with his hands folded in his lap, a tall man, formerly one of our most distinguished philosophical voices, now simply exhausted, his light organs barely visible through his robe. And he said that the signal was consuming power we could not spare, that he had made peace with what was coming, and that he hoped I could too. I told him I would stop when someone answered. He left without pressing the matter. He was, as I said, not an unkind man. On the 19th day, someone answered. I was not at the console when the reply came in. I had fallen asleep in the records chair. I am old, and old bones need rest even when circumstances are dire, and it was one of our junior comms officers, a young man named Eth Sorvan Vel, who woke me with his hand on my shoulder and a look on his face that I had no immediate category for. It was not the look of someone delivering good news. It was not the look of someone delivering bad news. It was the look of someone who has received information that does not fit into any existing framework and is waiting for someone older and wiser to make sense of it. He said, "There is a reply." I sat up. My light organs pulsed once involuntarily, bright flare of teal-white that surprised both of us. "From the council," I said. "No," he said, "from Earth." I want to say I understood immediately what that meant. I did not. My knowledge of Earth was archival. I had records on the species, of course, the standard xenological summary, a handful of cultural exchange files, the council registration documents from some years back. Humans, bipedal, blooded. Comparatively short-lived. Members of the Interstellar Assembly in good standing, though relatively junior in terms of political weight. I had no reason to associate them with the particular quality of what Eth was describing. There was something in his voice that I was not processing correctly. "Play it," I said. The message was not long. It was a standard hailing frequency response, logged in proper assembly format, with a transit authorization header that made Eth's voice crack slightly when he read it out to me, because the transit authorization was for Sector 14 Veth. A human voice, female. I would learn later. A fleet coordinator named Solus Dreven, speaking in assembly common with a slight accent, said the following: "Vessel Vale Sorvith Undara, this is ESV Cordial Passage. Convoy lead. 7 ships outbound on rescue bearing to your position. We have 3 transport vessels, 1 hospital ship, 2 logistics barges, a frigate escort. We have capacity for approximately 150,000 souls and supplies for further 60 days. Crossing Sector 14 Veth under our own authorization. We departed 4 hours after your signal reached our relay station, and we did not wait for council clearance. Our ETA at your position is 31 hours. Please have your passenger manifest ready. We will begin boarding as soon as docking is established. Cordial passage out." Eth was looking at me. I was looking at the speaker. I said, "Play it again." He played it again. 3 transport vessels. 1 hospital ship, 2 logistics barges, 1 Sentinel-class frigate escort. Capacity for 150,000 souls. The council had voted 12-3 against our rescue, on the grounds that the required corridor was treaty restricted. These humans had heard our signal, calculated what was needed, assembled 7 ships, and departed in 4 hours. Without waiting for council clearance, which meant they had crossed the restricted corridor on their own authority, which meant they had accepted whatever political and treaty consequences came with that crossing before they ever knew whether we were still alive to be saved. I sat in the records room for a long time after that. My light organs had gone very bright, which happens sometimes with strong emotion, and in the dark of the records room, I must have looked strange. An old woman blazing pale teal-white in the silence, both hands pressed flat on the console, taking slow breaths. Eth had the good sense not to say anything. After a while I said, "Wake the administrator." Then I said, "Wake everyone." The 31 hours were the strangest of my life. I will not pretend they were easy. 140,000 people who have been told their rescue is politically impossible and have spent 19 days quietly dying in the dark do not simply switch to a different state when told that 7 ships are inbound. There was grief that had no release valve until then, and the release was not clean. There was disbelief. Many people did not believe the message was real, and I cannot fault them for that, because nothing in our experience had prepared us for this particular category of event. There was the practical problem of preparing a passenger manifest for 140,000 fun souls when your record-keeping systems have been running on reduced power for 2.5 weeks. I spent most of those 31 hours in the records room doing exactly that work, Eth and 3 other junior archivists. And I will tell you that sorting a population manifest by medical priority is a humbling task when you are that population's keeper of records and every name on the list is a person you are responsible for. But I also remember the lights. As the hours passed and the news moved through the ship. And news moves through a ship like the Vale Sorveth Undara, the way light moves through. Still water, slowly, and then everywhere at once. The light on the residential decks changed. Not dramatically, not all at once. But I walked those decks again on the 28th hour of the wait. While the archivists worked without me, and the corridors were different. The families were still sitting along the walls, still wrapped in everything they owned. But the children were brighter. Not blazing yet, they were still depleted, still cold, still hungry, but brighter. A child who believes it might survive looks different from a child who has stopped believing that. And the difference is visible in the late organs, in a way that I will carry with me until my bones are hollow enough to carry nothing more. I was back at the console when the human convoy crossed into our sensor range. Eth called the distance out as the ships resolved on the screen. 7 signatures, exactly as promised, in a close formation convoy. The Sentinel-class frigate was at the rear, running quiet. Its weapons systems were not active, which I noted, and which I also noted that I was noting, and tried to understand why the inactive weapons felt like a kindness. The 3 transports were large, larger than I had expected from the capacity, numbers, which meant the humans had sent ships with room to spare. The hospital ship had its green running lights on, the universal assembly marker for medical priority vessel. The cordial passage hailed us first. Fleet Coordinator Solus Dreven's voice was the same as in the recording. Level, professional, entirely without drama. Vale Sorveth Undara. This is cordial passage. We are beginning docking approach. Please designate your primary docking ports. We will assign 1 transport per port. Begin boarding your medical priority passengers first. Our hospital ship, Istia Vera Grace, will dock at your medical bay. Have your manifest uploaded to our relay by the time we establish hard dock. Do you have any immediate structural emergencies we should know about? Our comms officer, not this time our actual senior comms officer, who had abandoned his principle of dignified silence, somewhere around hour 20, and was back at his station with red-rimmed eyes and both hands to the consoles, gave her the docking port designations and confirmed 2 areas of partial hull integrity concern that she noted without visible alarm, and routed to her engineering team within 30 seconds. It was the most ordinary conversation I have ever witnessed, and it undid me completely. I had been holding myself together for 19 days. I had kept the signal alive and the archive organized, and my voice steady when I spoke to the administrator, and when I walked the residential decks, and when I read the council's 12-3 verdict 3 times in the dark. I had been, in the modest way available to an old records keeper, with no particular authority, doing the work that needed doing. And then Solus Dreven's voice came over the comm, level and professional, asking about structural emergencies, and I sat down on the floor of the records room, and I could not get up for quite some time. Eth found me there. He did not say anything. He sat down on the floor beside me, which I thought was kind. The first human I met in person was not Solus Dreven. It was a woman from the hospital ship, ESV Vera Grace, part of the advanced medical team that came through the medical bay airlock 40 minutes after. The Vera Grace established hard dock. She was neither tall nor short by human standards, close-cut dark hair, and the kind of face that has learned to read a room in a single second, because her work requires it. She carried a medical case and wore a gray and white jumpsuit with the Vera Grace's designation on the shoulder. Her name, I learned later, was Dr. Yara Solon. She came into our medical bay with her team, 6 people moving quickly, efficiently, with a particular focused calm of people who have done difficult things in difficult conditions before, and long since stopped performing urgency when competence is the same thing at lower cost. Our medical officer, a man named Velsaran Dath, who had been working without meaningful rest for 11 of the past 19 days, met her at the door. She looked at him, just one look, the kind that takes in everything. The exhaustion, the makeshift triage stations, the rows of critical patients on improvised pallets along the bay walls, the dim glow of people too depleted to maintain steady light in their organs. And then she said, in Assembly Common, "Tell me what you need first." And the 2 of them were moving before the sentence was finished. I watched from the doorway. I had followed the announcement of the medical team's arrival because I am a records keeper, and it is my instinct to witness and document. What I saw in the next 10 minutes was something I did not have good language for then, and am not certain I have fully adequate language for now. The human medical team spread through our bay like water finding its level, without chaos, without wasted motion, simply occupying the space that needed occupying and doing the work that needed doing. One of them, a large man with quiet eyes, knelt beside an elderly Sorvith woman whose light had gone almost entirely out and placed a warming sleeve around her hands with the same matter of fact care you would use to hand someone a blanket on a cold evening. Another was already running a diagnostic scanner along the rows, speaking in a low voice to our medical officer, who was writing things down with the expression of someone who has just had their vocabulary tripled. Dr. Solon stood in the center of it all for exactly 30 seconds, turning slowly, taking the whole room in. Then she pulled up our manifest on her tablet, the one we had uploaded to the relay, and said, without looking up, "You have 412 critical. We can begin transfer in 20 minutes. I want the most fragile ones in the first group. Some of them may not survive the move," Velsarandath said. It was the thing he had been afraid to say for days, and you could hear the shape of those days in his voice. "I know," she said. "We'll move them anyway. Our ship is better equipped than this bay. Staying here is the worst risk." She looked up at him then. "You've done well with what you had." "Very well." He made a sound that I think surprised him. I went back to the records room. The boarding took 11 hours. I was not idle during those hours. No one on the Vale Sorvith Undara was idle, because moving 140,000 people from one set of vessels to another is an enormous logistical undertaking, even when everyone is cooperative and the receiving ships are excellently prepared, which ours were. The humans had sent personnel along with their ships, boarding coordinators, logistics officers, an entire team of what they called transit facilitators, whose job was apparently to move through the Sorvith population with translation devices and manifest tablets and an inexhaustible supply of calm, answering questions, directing people to their assigned transport, and occasionally simply sitting with a family that needed a moment before they make their feet move. I watched one of these transit facilitators, a young human man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of patient face that you do not expect to find on someone that young, sit with an elderly Sorvith couple for nearly 15 minutes. The couple had their granddaughter with them, a child of about 4, and the granddaughter would not leave the residential corridor, not because she was frightened of the humans, I do not think, but because she had spent 19 days in that corridor, and it had become, in the particular logic of childhood, the place where safety lived. The young man sat on the floor with her, cross-legged, at her height. He had a small illuminated device that projected shapes on the wall, and he made shapes with it for a while, and then the granddaughter made shapes back. And 15 minutes, the stunned granddaughter stood up and took the young man's hand and walked with him toward the docking corridor and the light beyond it. I put that in the archive. I did not know the young man's name, Dr. Solon I kept track of because she was in my sector of the ship, moving between the medical bay and the docking corridor in a pattern that I came to recognize over the hours. Transfer a group of critical patients to the Vera Grace, come back, assess the next group, consult with Vel Soran Doth, transfer another group. She ate a nutrition bar standing up at the corridor junction at the 4-hour mark, and I do not think she stopped moving. Otherwise, at the 9-hour mark, I heard the structural alert. It was not a catastrophic event. I want to be clear about that, because the word alert implies a drama that was not quite what happened. What happened was that the area of partial hull integrity concern that our comms officer had flagged during the initial contact, a section of the outer hull on the third transit deck, weakened by debris impact during the stellar event, had developed a secondary fracture. Not a breach, not yet, but the ship's automated system flagged it, and the corridor that ran along that section of hull was immediately sealed. The sealed corridor was the primary docking corridor for Transport 3. Transport 3 had completed the boarding of its assigned section of the population and was preparing to detach and move clear to allow the logistics barges to begin final supply and equipment transfer. The sealing of the primary corridor did not affect Transport 3's detachment. It did affect the boarding of the last group of critical patients from the medical bay, because the route to the Vera Grace's docking port now ran through the sealed section, and the secondary route added 20 minutes to every transit. I heard all of this in real time because I was in the corridor junction near the records room, which was near the medical bay, and the docking coordinator's voice was carrying. And then I heard Dr. Solon's voice. "I'm staying," she said. There was a pause from the coordinator, who I could not see around the junction. "Dr. Solon, the Vera Grace is prepped for detachment after the final group. Then she detaches. I'm staying with the last group until they're through. Tell Captain Varon I'll catch the final shuttle from the colony ship's secondary bay when we done." Another pause. "There's a structural alert on, I know," she said. "The fracture is in the outer hull, not the inner. The sealed section is sealed as a precaution. The medical bay is stable. I'll have these patients through the secondary route before the fracture develops further. Tell Captain Varon." Silence. Then the coordinator said, "Yes, Doctor," and I heard his footsteps going away. I came around the junction. Dr. Solon was already moving back toward the medical bay. She saw me and stopped. We looked at each other for a moment. I am not tall by Sorvith standards, and she was several centimeters shorter than me. She had the quality that I have noticed in certain people, regardless of species. Quality of taking up exactly as much space as the situation requires, no more and no less. "How many remain?" I asked. I knew the answer. 46 critical patients, the ones who had been assessed as too fragile to move earlier in the boarding and reassessed as movable now that the Vera Grace's resources were fully operational. 46, she said. "I know this ship," I said. "I know the secondary routes." She looked at me for a second. "Can you walk quickly?" "I can walk as quickly as required," I said. "Then come," she said. And she went back into the medical bay. The next hour and 40 minutes were the most physical work I have done in perhaps 20 years. The secondary route from the medical bay to the Vera Grace's docking port ran through 2 intermediate decks and across a section of the ship that had not been regularly trafficked during the drift, because it consumed power we could not spare to keep it lit. It was dark. It was cold. Moving critical patients through it 46 people, some on portable stretchers, some assisted by the 2 human medics who had stayed with Dr. Solon. Some able to walk with support was slow work. Dr. Solon did not hurry in the way that produces mistakes. She hurried in the way that produces results. She knew what she was looking at on the diagnostic readings. She knew which patients could be moved faster and which could not. She called instructions to her medics in a shorthand I could not always follow, and never had to question because the results spoke for themselves. I knew the corridors. I led. She followed, and I followed her lead, and it worked. The way improvised systems sometimes work, when the people operating them are paying close attention to the reality in front of them, rather than the plan they arrived with. At the 1-hour mark, we had 23 through. At the 90-minute mark, 38. Then the secondary hull fracture developed. Not catastrophically. The automated system sealed 2 more sections as a precaution, and the sound it made. A deep resonant clang that traveled through the Vale Sorvith Undara's hull in the way that sounds do in a vessel made, partially of hollow metal, was alarming in the way that loud, unexpected sounds in a failing ship are always alarming. One of the patients on a stretcher made a distressed sound. Dr. Solon was beside her immediately, one hand steady on the stretcher frame, level. "We're all right, keep moving." We kept moving. The last 8 patients took 40 minutes because 2 of them required Dr. Solon's continuous attention during the transit, and we could not increase the pace without risk. I led and she watched, and her 2 medics managed the others, and we moved through the dark corridors of the Vale Sorvith Undara, for the last time with 8 people whose lives had been in the balance for 19 days, and whose light organs were finally beginning to return. The last patient crossed the docking threshold into the Vera Grace at 11 hours and 47 minutes after the first boarding began. Dr. Solon stood in the docking corridor for a moment. Her hands were at her sides. She looked back, once, the port at the interior of the Vale Sorvith Undara, the dark corridors, the empty decks, the vast hull of the ship that had carried 140,000 people through 19 days of dying in place. Then she looked at me. "Is anyone still aboard?" she said. I had the manifest. I had been keeping the manifest through the whole boarding, the archivist's instinct that no act is complete until it is recorded. I checked it. "No," I said. "We are the last." She nodded. She closed the hatch. And then the automated systems completed the separation sequence, and the Vera Grace pulled away from the Vale Sorvith Undara for the last time. And the ship that had been my home, and the home of 140,000 of my people, for the length of our crisis, receded into the dark. I had been told there was an observation port near the medical recovery deck. I found it. It was a small circular window, perhaps 40 centimeters across, set into the hull between 2 equipment lockers. I my forehead against the glass the way I had done as a child on Sorvon Prime, looking out at the stars. Before I knew that the stars were places you could go to, and that some of those places would not welcome you, and that some of them would. The Vale Sorvith Undara was visible through the port. She was drifting now, carried by her last remaining momentum, moving slowly away from the human convoy into the dark. I could see the point where the secondary hull fracture had developed. A slight asymmetry in the outer hull's silhouette, barely visible at this distance. She was intact. She would drift for a long time probably before anything changed. She had carried us for 19 days, and now she was empty, and she would carry nothing for a long time. I became aware, after some minutes, that someone was standing beside me. Dr. Solon had found the observation port too. She was standing close enough that I could see her reflection in the glass. She was looking at the Vale Sorvith Undara, with an expression that I did not have precise language for at the time, and that I think I understand better now. It was not grief exactly. It was the look of someone who has finished a piece of work that mattered and is allowing themselves, for one quiet moment, to understand that it is finished. She had come for 46 people who could not easily move. She had stayed when she did not have to. She had led me through the dark corridors of a ship I knew better than she did, and followed my knowledge of those corridors without question. And I had followed her knowledge of her patients with equal trust, and we had moved 46 people through a failing section of a dying ship and gotten every one of them through. I had not until that moment fully processed that I was already on a human vessel, that the ship around me was not the Vale Sorvith Undara, that the light in the corridor behind us was warm and steady, and had been on for 11 hours, powered by something other than the bodies of my people. I pressed my hand flat against the observation port. There is a Sorvith gesture. We call it Vel Saran, which translates approximately as the light that remains, and you make it by pressing your hand against something solid and letting your light organs flare, so that the light travels from your palm into whatever you are touching. It is what you do for the dead, and for the things you are leaving behind that mattered, for the places you will not return to that were once home. I pressed my hand against the glass, and I let my light go bright, and I held it there, while the Vale Sorvith Undara drifted away. When I took my hand down, the print was on the glass in teal-white light for a moment, fading slowly. Dr. Solon did not ask what it meant. People who do difficult work well have a particular quality of knowing when silence is the correct thing to offer. She simply stood beside me, while the light faded, and the Vale Sorvith Undara became a shape, and then a point, and then was part of the dark with the rest of the stars. After a while she said quietly, "We have a somil sir, starting in 20 minutes on the recovery deck, if you're ready." I was not ready exactly, but I was also 140,000 people's keeper of records. And my people were eating for the first time in 19 days. And my job is to be where things are happening when things are happening. "Yes," I said, "I'll come." I filed the formal archive notation later that evening, sitting in a small workspace that the Vera Grace's crew had set up for me, with the particular thoughtfulness of people who had been briefed that I would need a place to work and had included, without being asked, a data terminal compatible with our archive format. The notation covers the factual record, the stellar event, the drift, the signal, the Council's 12-3 vote, the human convoy's departure 4 hours after our signal reached their relay, run EWO, off the crossing of Sector 14 Veth under independent authorization, the 11 hours and 47 minutes of boarding, the manifest confirmed complete. 140,007. The 7 are the medical team members who transferred back to their ship with the last patient group. All survived. No Sorvith lost in the transfer. The legal record of the corridor crossing took longer to resolve than the rescue itself. The Dreva Combine filed a formal treaty protest. The Human Assembly representation answered in writing with what I am told was a document of considerable precision, laying out in measured terms the distinction between a treaty obligation and a sentence of death by committee. The Council's formal response to the unauthorized crossing was filed 6 weeks after our rescue. I have read it. It is the kind of document that will be studied in political archives for a long time, not because it says anything particularly graceful, because it exists. Because someone felt it necessary to formally object to the rescue of 140,000 people from dying slowly in the dark. And that objection is now part of the permanent record, alongside the rescue itself. I put both in the archive. Objection. That is the archivist's job. To hold the whole thing, not only the parts that reflect well. I have not been back to the records room on the Vale Sorvith Undara, obviously. She is still drifting, by my last calculation, on a long, slow arc through the deep uninhabited now, moving away from everything. I think about her sometimes. I think about the corridors I walked on the 14th day, and the 19th, and the way the children looked when they believed again, and the teal-white light on the observation port glass as the ship grew small. The Sorvith are in provisional resettlement now. There is a world, not Sorvin Prime. Nothing will be Sorvin Prime again, but a habitable world with low enough gravity that our bones are comfortable. Designated as our interim home, while the permanent resettlement negotiations continue. Humans are involved in those negotiations. Humans are involved in the construction of the first habitat structures. There is a human aid coordinator on site who sends me weekly supply requisition updates with a level of administrative detail that I find genuinely comforting, because it is the detail of someone who intends for the project to succeed and is tracking the specifics that make success possible, rather than simply announcing good intentions. I have been thinking about what to call what the humans did for us. Not in political terms. The political terms are on record and will be argued over for years. but in the deeper sense, the philosophical sense, which is the sense my people spend the most time in. The Sorvith have a long tradition of thinking about what a life is worth. We are a philosophical people, as I have said, and the question of worth, of what one entity owes another, of where obligation ends and generosity begins, has occupied our thinkers for a long time. Most of our answers to that question are careful and bounded. They account for proximity, for kinship, for reciprocal relationship, for the realistic limits of what any individual or group can offer. They are sensible answers. They fit the shape of the world as we have generally understood it. The humans departed for our position 4 hours. After our signal reached there, they crossed a restricted corridor without authorization. They sent 7 ships for 140,000 people they had never met, with whom they had no kinship, to whom they owed nothing by any calculation we had ever used. They sent enough ships to carry every one of us, room to spare. They sent a hospital ship. They sent people with illuminated devices who would sit on the floor of a dark corridor for 15 minutes making shapes on the wall until a 4-year-old child was ready to walk toward the light. I do not have a good philosophical category for this. None of our careful, sensible, bounded answers fit the shape of it. I have been working on the problem for some months now, and I have not solved it, and I think perhaps I will not solve it in my remaining years. I will keep working on it, because that is what I do. What I have decided in the meantime is that the category does not matter. The Vale Sorvith and Dara drifted for 19 days in the dark, and on the 19th day 7, human ships arrived, and the humans took every one of us home, and Dr. Yara Solon stood beside me at an observation port on a vessel she had nearly missed her passage on, and watched a ship go dark and did not ask me what my hand on the glass meant, because some things do not need translation. The light that remains. I have filed everything in the archive. I have labeled this subfolder the answer, the same label I used for the Council's 12-3 verdict, because it seemed right that both answers should live in the same place, under the same name, for anyone who wants to compare them. The notation at the top of the subfolder reads, "We sent the signal for 19 days. On the 19th day, someone answered. They sent 7 ships for 140,000 people, and they crossed a restricted corridor on their own authority, and they did not lose a single one of us, and they stood beside us at the glass while the old ship went dark." There is one more line. It is not part of the official notation. It is a note to myself, the kind that keepers of records write in the margins of the archive when the factual record alone is not enough. They came because they could. That is all. That is the whole of it. They came because they could, and that turns out to be a sufficient reason, and I am still learning what that means about the universe I thought I understood.